Hello to everyone. Our lecture for today will be on the autonomic nervous system. So, reference will be your Bernard Levy. Uh, it will be your main textbook, followed by your Guyton and some diagrams from Netter. Now, the autonomic nervous system is often considered as a part of the motor system. However, instead of skeletal muscle, the effectors of this system are the smooth muscles, the cardiac muscles, and the glands, okay? Because the autonomic nervous system provides motor control of the viscera or the organs, it is sometimes called the visceral motor system. And an even older term for this system is the vegetative nervous system. Traditionally, the autonomic nervous system is a purely motor system. However, some autonomic motor fibers in peripheral nerves are accompanied by visceral afferent fibers that come from sensory receptors in the viscera. So many of these receptors would trigger reflexes, but the activity of some receptors evokes certain sensory experiences like pain, hunger, thirst, dizziness, and even a sense of distension of the organ. Now, what is the function of this system? Homeostasis is one, okay? For example, if there is a rise in your blood pressure, baroreceptors would be innervated. It would then go to your autonomic nervous system, and in turn, the reaction or the response would be a decrease in your blood pressure. Another function would be an appropriate and coordinated response to certain stimuli. Okay, so pupil size in response to light intensity is one example, and you're probably familiar with what we call the fight or flight response as well. So, what are the components of your autonomic nervous system? You have your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. In terms of the central components, which parts of the brain are essential or have a role? You have your hypothalamus and you have your limbic system as well. Now, what is the organization of the autonomic nervous system? Basically, the primary functional unit of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system is what you would call the two neuron motor pathway. And what does this consist of? It is made up of your preganglionic neurons, okay, whose cell body is located in the central nervous system, and a postganglionic neuron whose cell body is located in one of the autonomic ganglia, as you can see in the label. So you have preganglionic in red, and then postganglionic neurons colored dark blue. Now, in terms of location, sympathetic preganglionic neurons are basically found in the thoracic segment of your spinal cord as well as your upper lumbar segment. That's why another term for it would be your thoracolumbar division. Whereas your parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are located in the brainstem and your spinal cord, specifically in the sacral area, okay? Which is why it is also known as your craniosacral division. Now, for your sympathetic postganglionic neurons, this is found in the prevertebral and paravertebral ganglia. For your parasympathetic postganglionic neurons, okay, the location would be in your ganglia near or in the walls of the target organs themselves. Okay? So to summarize the previous slides I mentioned, you have this colorful diagram. Okay? Now, is the control of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system antagonistic? Actually, it's not. Okay? Is it coordinated? Yes. Okay? So basically, the control is a play of the sympathetic and parasympathetic wherein they reciprocate each other's actions and they are synergistic. Okay? So they work together. They're not antagonistic, strictly speaking. Now take note, not all visceral structures are innervated by both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Exceptions to the rule would be your smooth muscles, glands in the skin, and most blood vessels. So they have sympathetic innervation only. Okay? So take note of that. For the parasympathetic nervous system, it does not innervate the body wall, okay, but it could be seen in the head, thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic bodies. Okay. Now, for the sympathetic nervous system, we'll talk about this first, okay, followed by your parasympathetic. We mentioned already, sympathetic is your thoracolumbar, okay, division. If you want to be more specific, you can also find them in the following areas. Okay, so in the interomediolateral cell column, okay, aside from thoracolumbar segments, you have your C8, your lateral funiculus, your intermediate region, and parts of lamina X dorsal to the central canal. Those are their more specific locations. Okay. Now, the axons or the nerve cells of your preganglionic neurons are often small myelinated fibers known as your B fibers. However, take note, some are unmyelinated C fibers. Generally, in terms of distribution, they are all in one side or in the same side, ipsilateral ganglia. Okay? However, exceptions to that rule, meaning they occur on both sides or are distributed on both sides, would be in the intestine and pelvic viscera. Okay? And they tend to control a particular organ uh, with several, or rather, several segments have control over a particular organ. Okay? So, for example, for the head and neck, the segments C8 to T5, okay, have control over it, while T4 to T12 segments have control over your adrenal gland. Okay? So, here is a picture of your spinal cord taken from Netter. Okay? So, just to show you that there are certain groupings, okay, or segmentations taking control over certain organs because of such arrangement. Now, um, here is your diagram, which was taken from Dighton, showing the nerve connections between the spinal cord, spinal nerves, sympathetic chain, and peripheral sympathetic nerves. Okay? So, immediately after the spinal nerves would leave the spinal canal, the preganglionic sympathetic fibers leave the spinal nerve and pass through your white ramus, okay, into one of the ganglia of the sympathetic chain. Then, the course of the fibers can be in one of the following areas, okay, one of three possible choices. It can either synapse with postganglionic sympathetic neurons in the ganglion that it enters. It can pass upward or downward in the chain and synapse in one of the other ganglia of the chain, or it can pass for a lot of variable distances through the chain and then through one of the sympathetic nerves radiating outward from the chain, finally to synapse with a peripheral sympathetic ganglion. Okay? Now, some of the postganglionic fibers would pass back from the sympathetic chain into the spinal nerves through your gray ramus at all levels of the cord. Okay? These sympathetic fibers are very small, type C fibers, and they extend to all parts of the body by way of the skeletal nerves. What do they control? Your blood vessels, your sweat glands, and the piloerector muscles of the hairs. Okay? Now, your postganglionic neurons, okay, lie in your paravertebral ganglia. Okay? So, they would pass through your, or would be found in your gray communication ramus and then spinal nerves. You have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Okay? And as I mentioned earlier, they are distributed through your peripheral nerves as such and made up basically of unmyelinated C fibers. Okay. So, the sympathetic chain, okay, extends from the cervical to the coccygeal levels of the spinal cord. This arrangement serves as a distribution system that would enable your preganglionic neurons, okay, which are limited to the thoracic and upper lumbar segments to activate the postganglionic neurons that innervate all body segments. Okay? Uh, However, take note that there are fewer paravertebral ganglia than there are spinal segments because some of the segmental ganglia fused during embryonic development. Like for example, the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion, it represents the fusion of C1 to C4. Okay? Another example would be your middle cervical sympathetic chain, your inferior cervical, okay? And you have your stellate ganglion, okay? This is the fusion of the inferior cervical sympathetic ganglion with the ganglion of T1, okay? So, the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion, this one provides innervation to the head and neck, while the middle cervical and stellate are responsible for innervation of the heart, the lungs, and the bronchi. As I mentioned earlier, sympathetic preganglionic neurons, they are distributed to ipsilateral ganglia or same side, okay? And thus, they would control autonomic function on the same side of the body, with some exceptions. So, one important exception to the sympathetic innervation of the intestine and the pelvic viscera is bilateral. Okay? So, here is a diagram of your superior cervical ganglion as well as the other fused ganglia. Now, moving on to our parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. So, if you want to be more specific, we did say that it is the craniosacral division. So, preganglionic are found in your brainstem, okay, and intermediate regions of S2 and S4. For the postganglionic, they are found in the cranial ganglia and near the walls of the visceral organs like thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic cavities. This is a diagram of your parasympathetic uh, nervous system, okay, gotten from BRS, Physiology. So, the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are located in several cranial nerve nuclei in the, again, brainstem, as well as intermediate regions. Okay? So, here it's a bit simpler to see. Okay? So, this diagram, I think I got this from Guyton, if I'm not mistaken. So basically, the cranial nerve nuclei that contain parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are called your Edinger-Westphal nucleus. This is for your cranial nerve 3. Okay? For the superior, you have your cranial nerve 7. Okay? And then for the inferior, you have your cranial nerve 9, your salivatory nuclei, and the dorsal motor nucleus and nucleus ambiguus. Okay? So, postganglionic parasympathetic cells are located in cranial ganglia, including your ciliary ganglion, the pterygopalatine and submandibular ganglia, okay, and the otic ganglion, where the path of the red ball basically was pointing to your ciliary ganglion, pterygopalatine, submandibular, and then your otic. Here is a table showing you again the different structures that I mentioned and the structures or the organs that they would innervate. Okay, so for your Edinger-Westphal, okay, it has a role in the eyes for the ciliary muscles. Your superior salivatory nuclei, they have a role in your lacrimal gland, nasal and oropharyngeal glands, okay, via your pterygopalatine ganglion. And then your superior salivatory nuclei again, going to your submandibular ganglion, it would innervate your submandibular gland, sublingual salivary glands, oral cavity glands, your inferior salivatory nuclei via your otic ganglion would innervate your parotid and glands in the mouth. So, dorsal motor nuclei is secretomotor to your neck, thorax, and abdomen, while nucleus ambiguus has visceromotor and brachiomotor functions. Okay? This one was taken from Guyton. It's just another schematic diagram of the uh, ganglia. Okay? We move on to the visceral afferent fibers. So for the visceral, most of these afferent fibers would supply information that originates from sensory receptors in the viscera. Okay? So the activity of many of these sensory receptors never reaches the level of consciousness. Instead, these receptors would initiate the afferent limb of reflex arcs. Both your viscerovisceral and viscerosomatic reflexes are elicited by these afferent fibers. So, visceral reflexes operate at a subconscious level and they are very important for homeostasis and adjustment to your external environment. Okay? Now, the fast-acting neurotransmitters released by visceral afferent fibers are not well documented, although many of these neurons release an excitatory amino acid transmitter like, for example, your glutamate. However, visceral afferent fibers do not contain, or rather, they do contain many neuropeptides or combinations of neuropeptides. Examples would be your angiotensin 2, okay, calcitonin, gene-related peptide, cholecystokinin, oxytocin, etc. The more complete list is this one, the table that is right before you. Now, visceral afferent fibers that mediate sensation include your nociceptors that travel in sympathetic nerves such as the splanchnic nerves. Okay? So, visceral pain is caused by excessive distension of your hollow viscera, contraction against an obstruction, or ischemia. The origin of visceral pain is often difficult to identify because of its diffuse nature and its tendency to be referred to somatic structures. Okay? Visceral nociceptors in sympathetic nerves reach the spinal cord via the sympathetic chain, the white, ramus, and dorsal roots. Okay? The terminals of nociceptive afferent fibers are distributed widely in the superficial dorsal horn and also in your laminae 5 and 10. They activate not only local interneurons, which participate in reflex arcs, but also projection cells, which include spinothalamic tract cells that signal pain to the brain. So take note that dorsal columns not only contain pathway afferents for somatic sensation, but they also have your second-order neurons of the visceral pain pathway. So, visceral pain signals or nociceptive signals are then transmitted to the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus, and it is said that from there it would go to the cerebral cortex. So, interruption of this pathway would account for beneficial effects of surgically induced lesions of the dorsal column at the lower thoracic levels to relieve pain. Okay, like for example, for cancer patients, okay, wherein the cancer is in the pelvic organs. So, it would relieve or decrease the pain. Other visceral afferent fibers travel in parasympathetic nerves. So, these fibers are generally involved in reflexes rather than sensation. Okay, exception would be your taste fibers. Example would be, another would be your baroreceptor afferent fibers that innervate your carotid sinus via your glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, they enter the brainstem, pass through your solitary tract, and end in the nucleus of the solitary tract. So these neurons connect with interneurons in the brainstem reticular formation. The interneurons in turn project to the autonomic ganglionic neurons that control heart rate and blood pressure. So, again, the nucleus of the solitary tract, take note, receives information from all visceral organs except those in the pelvis. Now, the enteric nervous system, this is a diagram taken from Moore anatomy, okay, of the innervation of the small intestine. So basically, enteric nervous system, you have about 100 million neurons in the walls of your GI tract. This is a bit familiar from your histology, I hope, but basically, myenteric plexus is found between your circular and longitudinal smooth muscles responsible for your GI motility. Okay. Also, there is a plexus in the submucosal layer, this time responsible for body fluid homeostasis. So, types of neurons that would be present in the enteric nervous system would be your motor neurons, your interneurons, and your primary afferent neurons. Okay? So, modulation by the sympathetic nervous system, uh, chemical mediators, for example, your norepinephrine, would be responsible in inhibiting intestinal motility. Norepinephrine and neuropeptide Y would regulate blood flow. Norepinephrine and somatostatin to control intestinal secretion. Your acetylcholine, okay, and the others mentioned here would be for eccrine sweat glands. Okay? So, feedback by intestinofugal neurons from myenteric plexus to sympathetic ganglia. Okay? So, feedback is provided by your intestinofugal neurons. These ones would project back from the myenteric plexus to the sympathetic ganglia. Okay? So, if you'll notice, activity in the enteric nervous system is modulated by your sympathetic nervous system. As I mentioned earlier, plexus in the submucosal layer would have the following roles: regulate ion and water transport, glandular secretion, and communication with your myenteric plexus to ensure coordination. Okay? So, many of the neurons contain neuropeptides, and obviously neural networks are well organized. Okay, so main type of neuron in the autonomic ganglia is the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so these cells receive synaptic connections from preganglionic neurons, and they project to autonomic effector cells. However, many autonomic ganglia also contain interneurons. These interneurons process information within the autonomic ganglia. The enteric plexus can then be considered as an elaborate example of this kind of processing. Okay, so one type of interneuron found in some autonomic ganglia contain a high concentration of catecholamines. Therefore, these interneurons have been called your SIF or SIF cells, meaning your small, intensely fluorescent cells, and they are believed to be inhibitory in character. Okay, so I'll cut off this slide. Next topic will be on neurotransmitters. Okay. So for the neurotransmitters, for the autonomic ganglia, these ones are found between your postganglionic neurons and autonomic effectors. So adrenergic neurons tend to release norepinephrine. On the other hand, cholinergic neurons, whether in the parasympathetic or sympathetic nervous system, would release your acetylcholine. Okay? So, non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic neurons include some postganglionic parasympathetic neurons of the GI tract, and they would release the following substances. Okay? This is a simple diagram from BRS, Physiology, depicting the neurotransmitters. Okay? So, acetylcholine, the classic neurotransmitter of your autonomic ganglion is acetylcholine. This is whether we are talking about sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? So, the two classes of acetylcholine receptors in autonomic ganglia are your nicotine and muscarine receptors, and they are named as such because of their responses to the plant alkaloids nicotine and muscarine. Both receptors, they mediate excitatory postsynaptic potentials, but these potentials have different time courses. Stimulation of your preganglionic neurons elicits a fast EPSP, okay, followed by a slow EPSP, or your excitatory postsynaptic potential. The fast EPSP results from activation of nicotinic receptors, which would cause your ion channels to open, while the slow EPSP is mediated by muscarinic receptors, primarily the M2 receptor that inhibit what you would call your M current, okay, which is a current produced by conductance of potassium. So, your nicotine, again, is the receptors respond to nicotine. But they can be blocked by your curare and hexametonium. Your muscarine is another plant alkaloid. Okay. This is where your muscarinic receptors would react to, okay? And it is blocked by your atropine. So, sympathetic postganglionic neurons, they would typically release norepinephrine, which excites some effector cells but inhibits others. The receptors on target cells may be either alpha or beta adrenergic receptors, okay? So, these receptors are further subdivided into alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, and beta 2 receptors. Now, what is the difference of your alpha 1 from alpha 2? Here is a table showing you the difference. So, alpha 1 is postsynaptic in location. Okay, so alpha 1. Alpha 2 could be either pre or post. Okay. Prazosin is a drug-selective alpha 1 adrenergic antagonist, while that one is the case for alpha 2 in terms of your yohimbine. So, yohimbine is a selective alpha 2 adrenergic antagonist. So, alpha 1 is mediated by activation of your IP3 messenger system, while alpha 2 decrease rate of synthesis of CAMP through your G protein. Okay? On the other hand, what are your beta receptors? So, basically, you also have your B1 and B2. Okay? B1 or beta 1 is basically for excitation. Beta 2 is relaxation. Beta 1, you have your norepinephrine and epinephrine. For beta 2, you have more epinephrine. Beta 1 has a role in these locations of the heart. Beta 2 would be found in your vascular smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, bronchial muscle, GI tract, and bladder. In terms of messengers, it's the same for beta 1 and 2. And that is to activate adenylate cyclase, okay, to increase your CAMP. This table shows you the roles in general of your alpha and beta receptors, and this one is found in your textbook in your Byrne and Levy. Okay, so again, their actions are coordinated and synergistic, okay, and not necessarily antagonistic. Okay, so the parasympathetic postganglionic neurons would release acetylcholine. Okay, for the parasympathetic nervous system, you have muscarinic receptors. There are different types, M1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so take note of the role. They have particular roles like M1 for gastric acid secretion, and so on and so forth. Okay? So basically, they are inhibitory in the heart. They would decrease heart rate, decrease conduction velocity in the AV node, but they are excitatory in the smooth muscle and in the glands. For example, increased GI motility, increased secretion. Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, in the heart, it's excitatory in character. For the smooth muscle and glands, more of inhibitory. Okay. Or rather, the opposite. For the heart, it's inhibitory. And then for the smooth muscle, it is excitatory in character. Okay. Now, there are different pathways that influence your autonomic activity. You have your reflex pathways, for example, and then certain areas of your hypothalamus. But this one will be discussed in other lectures. Okay. So the following slides are basically some examples of the central control of autonomic function. Like for example, for the cranial nerve 3 or Edinger-Westphal nuclei, okay, responsible for pupillary light reflex. Sympathetic actions would be pupillary dilation, parasympathetic would be constriction of the pupils. Okay? So, clinical correlation, you have what you call your Argyll-Robertson's pupil. This is caused by syphilitic meningitis. Okay, so usually what happens here, if you flash a light into the eyes of the patient, there would be pupillary constriction, okay, during accommodation, but or there is no response to light. Okay. So, it is also called your prostitute's pupil because it accommodates but does not react. Okay. Another example would be in the urinary bladder. So, for this one, sympathetic nervous system, the action would be, the tendency would be to hold the urine inside the bladder. Okay. While parasympathetic nervous system, when this is the one that is dominant or the one that is triggered, the tendency is for the person to urinate. Okay? Okay, so greatest concentration of your autonomic centers are found in your hypothalamus. Okay? Now, in terms of additional clinical correlation, there is a certain parasite called your Trypanosoma cruzi. Okay. So, if this parasite infects you, you might develop what you call Chagas disease. And what happens is, it would bind to the receptors in your heart, okay, to the beta-adrenergic and M2 acetylcholine receptors, and that would lead to loss of parasympathetic control. Okay? So, uh, eventually, it could lead to your arrhythmia and in the GI tract, um, lack of peristalsis. Okay? So, that is the end of our lecture. I hope you learned something. Thank you for your attention.